Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Last Catch, Conversations on the Columbia and Snake Rivers. I'm Melissa Macy, and I have to say, when I first saw the title of today's episode, Rock of Ages, I wasn't sure if I should brush up on my geology or warm up for karaoke. Also have a great mullet wig that I thought about wearing today. But we are here today for something that is much more profound: the survival of salmon, the health of our rivers, and the responsibility we all share to future generations. Humor can lighten the load, but the heart of this conversation is deeply serious, ensuring that our rivers, our cultures, and our communities continue to thrive for ages to come. Today, we're going to start at the beginning, like quite literally, from time immemorial. Our speakers will take us into the history of a place that has always been sacred, where stories and rocks, waters, and salmon are bound together with the lives of people. This is more than a history lesson. It's a reminder of our collective responsibility to honor and carry forward what has been protected and cherished since the beginning of time. With that, I'm honored to introduce our guests who will help guide us through this geological journey. Our first speaker this evening is Jim O'Connor, geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Our second guest is Pat Baird, archaeologist with the Nez Perce tribe. Welcome. And our third speaker is Dr. Lydia Steich, research geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. I think it's really important for us to understand the lay of the land. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jim, who's going to give us some context on the geological features of this beautiful region, and will help just sort of help us in the conversation that we will have soon over the course of this evening. So, Jim.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be part of this. I'm a geologist for the USGS in Portland, Oregon. I work with Lydia Steich, and we both have our offices on the campus at Portland State University in Portland. And what I'm going to do here is just try to provide some overall geologic context for the Columbia River and its basin. And I call the Columbia River a big river on the leading edge, and hopefully it'll be clear why it's on the leading edge. And then also using that context, I want to talk about what that means in terms of how the Columbia River operates, at least geologically. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we're going to start big. Here's a map of the globe, basically showing the largest 50 or so rivers. And of those, the Columbia ranks about 32nd in size, 725,000 square kilometers, about 250,000 square miles. And if we go to the next slide, please. And of course, these rivers are on continents, and these continents are on geologic plates that are mobile across the crust of the earth. And these and the boundaries between these plates have different characteristics. Some of the plates are moving apart from rift zones. Some are coming together in collisional zones, and some are moving past each other sideways. And some of these plate boundaries, like the San Andreas Fault, that's a sideways slipping plate boundary, a transform boundary. But then here on the west coast of North America, we have a collisional boundary, the Cascadia subduction zone. But what's important, I think, and what makes the Columbia River unique is it is the only large river on the globe that drains towards a collisional plate boundary. This makes the river special. And on the map on the right, the collisional boundaries are marked by the red triangles that are volcanoes. And volcanism is commonly associated with these colliding boundaries. But the Columbia is special because it is the only large river in the world that drains towards a collisional boundary and bisects the volcanic arc as it does. Next slide, please. Here's kind of another picture of that. The North American plate is moving west relative to the Pacific Ocean, and the Columbia River is draining towards that boundary. All the other rivers in the world, most of them, all the large ones like the Mississippi, the Amazon, they drain away from collisional boundaries towards what are called passive margins. You can go to the next slide, please. One nice, convenient way of tracking the Columbia River Basin is looking at what the Yellowstone hotspot has done over the last 15 or 20 million years. As the North American plate has been moving westward over this hotspot underneath the crustal plate, the locus of volcanism moves toward the east as the plate is passing over that to the west. So 16 million years ago, the Yellowstone hotspot was near the Oregon, Idaho, Nevada boundary. Now, of course, it's under Yellowstone National Park in far northwestern Wyoming. So that distance is how far the plate has moved over the last 15 or so million years ago. 30 million years ago, it was essentially at the coast. So the continent is moving and to the west and colliding with the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific plate, or actually a smaller plate that's adjacent to the Pacific plate, and diving, and that Pacific plate is subducting underneath the Western North America. You go to the next slide, please. And the cartoon in the lower right is showing how that subduction process works. The oceanic plate is descending beneath the westward moving North American plate, and as that Pacific plate, or the Juan de Fuca plate in this case, dives down, it produces volcanism, which has created the Cascade Range in northwestern northwestern U.S. And the Columbia River, it flows right through that volcanic range. Okay, go to the next slide, please. So this makes the position of the Columbia River Basin on the leading edge of a continent, at a collisional boundary, makes the Columbia River unique, as I said. One component of that uniqueness is the Columbia River and the Snake River, primary tributary, are much steeper than most large rivers. And the graph there is showing profiles of the Columbia River, longitudinal profiles of the Columbia and the Snake River, compared to the Mississippi, Missouri River system, which has a gradient that's maybe a quarter to a third that of the Columbia and Snake. Next slide, please. But it's more than just what the rivers look like. It's also what's also important about being in this geologically dynamic environment is how the processes operate. And I'm just going to give examples of sort of 4 different types of things that have happened in the Columbia River that are indicative of how this river works and why it's so unique. The first one I'm going to talk about are these tremendous flood basalts that occurred about 15 million years ago. And these are related actually to the passage of the Yellowstone hotspot. These are tremendous lava flows that extended from eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, western Idaho into the Columbia River system and flowed. Many of them flowed down the Columbia Valley all the way out to the Pacific. And the photograph shows a couple of these flows not too far from Portland. Next slide, please. So these flows, there was hundreds of them 15 million years ago. Both mark where the Columbia River was 15 million years ago, but they also transformed the river. They shoved the river to the west up against the Cascade Range, and some of that course still remains from these lava flows of 15 million years ago. Next slide, please. This slide shows a map of the Columbia and the Snake River joining in central Washington and the Pasco Basin. And you can see just above the confluence that the Columbia River makes this big swing to the west. Here it's been diverted by these lava flows, these Columbia River basalt lava flows of 15 million years ago. But these lava flows also control what the river looks like locally too. And the next slide will be an example of that. This is one of these lava flows upstream of the Dalles. This is the entrance to Long Narrows, which was a very important fishery before it was inundated by the Dalles Dam. Next slide, please. And Celilo Falls also is, these waterfalls are tumbling over one of these lava flows, as is the case with Willamette Falls in the Willamette Basin. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move from 15 million years ago to 15,000 years ago. And another unique aspect of the Columbia River Basin is its location on the globe. It's a mid-latitude temperate basin on the western edge of the continent. So it's in the weather, basically. And today the weather is great, but at the last ice age, 15,000 years ago, the weather was not so hot for quite a long time. The glaciers in the Canadian Coast Range, the Canadian Rockies coalesced, formed this huge ice sheet that advanced south into what's now the United States. And some of these lobes of ice pushed the river around. So that's one mechanism for changing the course of the Columbia. But one lobe of ice blocked the Clark Fork River in northern Idaho, creating this huge lake, Glacial Lake Missoula. This lake filled, it breached the ice dam and created a huge flood that coursed across what we now call the channeled scablands down the Columbia and out to the Pacific. The area in blue is the area that was inundated by the lake. The area in gray is the area that was flooded by the largest of these floods. And there wasn't just one flood. There was probably on the order of 100 of them between about 17,000 and 15,000 years ago. And of course, the ice here in this diagram represents the maximum extent of the ice during the last ice age. So these floods also shaped the river. Some of them resulted in major river course changes, as did the advancing ice. Next slide, please. So these floods were immense, 1,000 feet deep in the Columbia River Gorge. You can see where these floods have swept the soil off of the older Columbia River basalt, creating what's now known as scabland. We're fortunate to have an artist rendition of this flood. The next slide, please. From Crown Point, this is iconic view up the Columbia River Gorge from the Portland area. And the next slide shows the artist's rendition of this approaching flood. These floods were huge, 1,000 feet deep at Crown Point, back flooded up the Willamette as far south as Eugene. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move from 15,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, where in the Columbia River Gorge, where the Columbia River bisects the volcanic arc of the Cascade Range, the high terrain spawns landslides. And these landslides can have tremendous effects on the river corridor. And in fact, one about 500 years ago blocked the Columbia. This is the so-called Bonneville landslide, or it's also known as the Bridge of the Gods landslide. And this depiction that was created by the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Resources shows the Bonneville Dam on the left and the actual road bridge, Bridge of the Gods at Cascade Locks on the right. And this landslide blocked the Columbia River, probably to a depth of about 300 feet. And the oral traditions are pretty compelling that this blockage created a fishery blockage for many years. And then once at some point, the lake behind this blockage, behind this landslide dam breached, but it didn't cut all the way back down. And the legacy is Cascade Rapids. If you could have the next slide, please. This is evidence of the impoundment behind the landslide dam. This is something that Lewis and Clark, in particular, Clark recorded on his way down the river in 1805. And the impoundment drowned the riparian forests that flanked the river at the time. And from dating, both tree ring dating and radiocarbon dating of those trees that were killed by the impoundment created by the landslide, we now know that this landslide occurred in the winter of 1544, 1545. Next slide, please. When the river cut back down, it didn't cut all the way back down. It left sort of a remnant part of the landslide dam that was historically known as Cascade Rapids, a pretty profound navigation barrier, and one example of how these geologic interactions form persistent effects on the river corridor. Next slide, please. Final example is from events of just a couple hundred years ago. Both Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens have erupted frequently over the last several tens of thousands of years. The most recent one was, besides the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, of course, was an eruption of Mount Hood in the 1780s. And these eruptions have shed tremendous amount of volcanic material into the river corridors. In this case, I'm showing the Sandy River was filled with tens of feet of sediment in the years after the eruption, burying the forests that were flanking the river in this sandy sediment. And the same thing has happened on the Cowlitz River, the Tougal River, the Lewis River, and the Kalama River draining Mount St. Helens. And it's probably not a coincidence that these rivers are now the primary smelt run rivers of the Pacific Northwest. Just another example of how these geologic processes interact with the ecologic and cultural use of the river corridor. And I think that is kind of sums it up. Basically, what I wanted to do was give the overall context and then some examples of how that context sort of plays out in terms of the river system and its ecologic and cultural utilization.
Wow. I feel like the exploding head emoji right now. I didn't say this when we started out, but I am a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon, and we are a people of the Columbia River. You know, we have our stories that connect us to place that have been shared with our community members. But this conversation is so interesting to me because I literally just learned a whole bunch of new things about the basin that we're tied to as Wasco and Warm Springs people. So thank you. That was very informative. I have some questions that I'd love to ask the full panel. How has the Columbia River's course changed over time and why? I think you alluded to some of that, but I'd be curious of all of your perspectives on that.
Well, I'll just say a couple words on that and then let other folks chime in. I think it's important to note that the Columbia River has changed course many times and it's still changing course, but the timescales and the processes have sort of varied over time. At the time scale of the Columbia River basalts in millions of years, the river has made some huge jumps, tens, if not hundreds of miles. But at shorter time scales, for example, the time scales of the Missoula floods and the ice ages, the glaciers and the floods have altered the course of the river in places. And then in the last few hundred years, just the landslide, the Bonneville landslide pushed the river 5 kilometers south there. And the eruptions from Mount Hood 200 years ago pushed the Columbia River about a mile north at what we now call the Sandy River Delta, or 1,000 acres if you're a dog walker out there. So these changes, and I'll just add, in the last few decades, the river continues to sort of inch by inch move around, especially in the wider, sandier reaches. So there's been all sorts of changes at different time scales.
Other folks on the panel want to share some insight about the changing of the course of the river?
Yeah, I'm Lydia Steich again. I work with Jim, and so we talk about this often a lot. But one of the things I wanted to add, of course, that Jim is extremely familiar with is that not only has the Columbia River undergone an enormous amount of change from so many major geodynamic mechanisms, floods, climate change, and everything, but one of the interesting things about it is that it's very persistent. The river has stayed its general course from the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean for a considerable amount of time, despite having, faults dissecting it, entire mountain ranges rising up underneath it. The Yellowstone hotspot has had major perturbation to the snake in the Columbia River systems, and they still sort of hold some course down to what we see today. So they've jumped around, but they're persistent.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. We know the Columbia River has basically crossed the Cascade Range at about the same place for the last 15 or 20 million years. There have been bigger shifts out in other places, but it's been remarkably persistent, and the reasons for that are really fun to speculate. And the reasons must also relate to the fact that it is the only river large river that drains towards a collisional tectonic boundary. There's some special circumstances that make the river special.
Thank you for sharing that insight. I have a follow-up question, and I think there was a little bit of discussion about why this is so unique. I'll share that I was in Iceland visiting a carbon capture project, and there was a lot of discussion about basalt. And what I learned during that trip was that the basalt basin that we have is very similar to a basalt basin outside of Reykjavik. Again, the exploding mind emoji for me, because I just was like, wow, are there other things that make this area unique on this planet?
I have been to Iceland, and I am struck by the similarity of the landscapes. It reminded me a lot of the Deschutes Basin, I have to say. And the tectonic environment of Iceland is completely different, though. Iceland is sitting at a place where the continents are moving away from each other instead of converging. So there's no big rivers on Iceland, in part because it's pretty small landmass. But there are some similarities in terms of there's a lot of basalt in Iceland too, and there's a lot of basalt in the Pacific Northwest, and some of it is, the Pacific Northwest geolog. It's in the collisional zone, but we're also kind of feeling the effects of basin and range extension kind of creeping up to the north, and that's been one reason why, especially in the Deschutes Basin, there's a lot of basalt, and in the Snake River Plain as well.
I'm curious. We've talked about how the Columbia has changed. Has the Snake River always been where it currently is, or has that changed as well?
I can take that one. It's changed quite a lot, actually. So this is some of the research that Jim and I are working on together, and the tools that we're using are the sand. That's one of the tools that we're using, is to use the sand from various different rivers, both the ancestral rivers that have left deposits behind, but also the modern rivers that we have today. And one of the methods I focus on trying to figure out this very question of where did these rivers go and why did they change and how did they change, is by using these little grains of sand that are zircon crystals. And by using them, you can find out which parts of the rivers have contributed sand into a basin over time. And with this method, a few years ago, we published a paper basically saying that the Snake River has changed fairly considerably over time. And I call it the Snake River, this river that's changed quite a lot because of where it starts, but not where it ends up. And so that the nomenclature can get a little bit confusing, but the Snake River that I call the ancestral snake starts basically where the Snake River starts now in Idaho, and flowed into the Columbia Basin, not where it currently flows in. So currently it flows in through Hell's Canyon, North America's deepest canyon. But it didn't always do that. It actually circumnavigated the Northern Rocky Mountains, according to some of our research, and possibly entered the Columbia Basin in the northeast, near like Spokane region, is what we're thinking. Finding out exactly where it went is kind of difficult because we're trying to find those geologic clues through the landscape and how it's changed over time. And so in some places we have a lot of really, really good data. In other places it gets a little sparse. I call it my trail of breadcrumbs. And that shift happened, we think, somewhere in the 4 to 2 million year range. And the reasons why we think the Columbia and the Snake River confluence changed so dramatically was possibly due to the Yellowstone hotspot. So Jim showed a diagram earlier of how the Yellowstone hotspot has moved, or how the North America has moved over the hotspot, basically. But with that hotspot comes topography. So currently where the Yellowstone hotspot is, there's a bit of a bulge in the Earth's surface. And that bulge has probably tracked through the North American continent as the Yellowstone hotspot has migrated too. And so rivers have to move around something that big. And that's one of basically the main mechanism that we think is driving this pretty major river reorganization.
Wow. Thank you for so much for sharing that. I have another follow-up question on the Snake River. I'm curious about. I've rafted the Snake River through Hell's Canyon, and absolutely amazing experience to be on the river, with community members from Perce to learn. But I just was curious. How did that canyon actually get formed? And you can see in the canyon itself, when you travel through Hell's Canyon on a raft, you get to a point where the water slows down. And we'll talk about the impact about damming the river. But I'm curious, like, how did that actually get to be the deepest canyon that it is known for now?
So I think it's a multi-phase process. You don't get one deep canyon quite that deep so suddenly. And I think one of the other observations that's really helpful to add context to this is that the Snake River is super, super steep in Hell's Canyon, right? And you've seen it on the river. But if you go right next door to the Salmon River, the landscape looks really different. It's still a deep canyon, but it's more broad. It's more like open. And so in the two phases of two series of incision rates, periods in the Snake and in the Snake River through Hell's Canyon, I think the first phase was one that affected a broad region, including the Salmon and the Clearwater and the Snake River, to cause the initial incision, basically entrench some of those river systems early on into where they are. But then the Snake River, I think, has had something happen pretty unique to it, which is the Yellowstone hotspot migration. And so we think that maybe 3 to 2 million years ago, the basin in which the Western Snake River Plain exists, it got a lot bigger to incorporate also the Eastern Snake River Plain. And with that increased area comes more sand, comes more water, and allowed for a series of geologic events to cause a much more focused history of river downcutting into just the Hell's Canyon region. And I think that's kind of what adds to why that particular area is also special too, is because it's had this very dramatic incision that happened. And we have some colleagues that have dated the timing of that very steep incision, the more recent one, using caves that have that are above the Snake River in Hell's Canyon. And so by dating the sediment in the caves, they've been able to figure out that incision must have accelerated probably about 2 million years ago. And so that phase that was just focused on Hell's Canyon, we think happened around then.
Thank you so much. I want to just lift up a comment that was made made by Alyssa from Warm Springs. Her comment is, the Columbia River has a name that is known to our tribal community, which is Inchiwana. So I just wanted to lift that up because that's really important when we talk about connection to place, is recognizing that before it was the Columbia River, to us, it was Inchiwana. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Alyssa. Thank you for posting that. I have another question that came up that I'd love to just ask really quick. And this is a question from the comments about the natural forces that impacted the shape or direction of the Columbia River. Which of those had the greatest impacts? Was it the floods? Was it the landslides? Or was it the volcanoes in terms of shaping how the Columbia River acts right now?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I kind of think it depends on who or what you are and where you are at the time the floods or the landslides or the lava flows happen. I think I would say in broad strokes, the biggest changes of the Columbia River owe to volcanism and the river course being blocked and diverted by lava flows, in broad strokes. But if you're if you're interested in what's happened in the last few thousand years, it's not so much the lava flows, it's some of the other volcanism products like the mud flows. Someone mentioned the Mount Hood mud flow, which was about 100,000 years ago. The pulses of sediment from Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens of the last couple thousand years, those have created pretty significant shifts in the rivers, as have the more recent landslides. So the big shifts are from lava flows in the northern part of the basin, from the glaciers coming down and pushing the river around. But the more recent shifts, and the ones that have probably had the most pronounced effects on the modern river ecology and the human uses of the river, have probably been these more frequent and sort of smaller scale processes like the landslides and the recent volcanic eruptions that have not created lava flows that have entered the river, but have created these big sediment pulses that have affected the river.
Thank you so much for that. I am, again, this is so fascinating to me to learn about the river basin from a geological perspective. I want to transition into some questions about fish, but I did just want to recognize that we've got a lot of people tuning in this evening from lots of places, including Mexico. We've got somebody calling in from South Vancouver Island, and lots of people in the beautiful state of Washington, some friends in Coeur d'Alene, and of course, we've got somebody from Warm Springs tuning in. So I just want to say thank you all for being here. It's really great to be connected to you in this moment. Pat, I have a question. In geological time, when did salmon and steelhead appear in the river systems? And were people at that time living near the river? Like, where did that convergence? We have our stories as Native people about how this happened. I'm curious to hear what is the sort of the geological Western science understanding of this connection.
Well, I am not a fish biologist, so I can't tell you really how long they've been in the river. I mean, from an archaeological perspective, there's a real shift to focus on fish in the last roughly 2,000 years. It's not really clear if that shift really that we're seeing in the archaeological record really is reflecting like tribal people as are focusing more on fish as they stay longer in one place as the populations grow, so that becomes a more viable food source. Certainly climate change is having an effect. In the Younger Dryas, when it's just warmer, I think that the thought is that the fish are populations are just not as large, but as the climate cools a little bit, I mean, not as much as it had done in the ice ages, but cools a little bit, salmon and steelhead, and other anadromous fishes become are just a lot more successful. But I think from a tribal perspective, I don't know that how much of that evidence that the archaeologists are seeing is a reflection of reality. I mean, for Nez Perce, so much of the culture about around fishing doesn't really create a situation where you're going to see a lot of fish remains in an archaeological context. I mean, our tribal fishermen put as much of the remains back in the river as they can. So it's not in a dump site, next to the village. So it's possible and probably even likely that there's a lot more fishing going on than we're seeing in the archaeological record. And we see artifacts for fishing. We see net weights and we see hooks and structure for like fish walls and things like that. I mean, it becomes more common as we move through time. One of the things I want to talk about really briefly too is just how long we know people have been here. The oldest archaeological sites in the Pacific Northwest and really in North America really now are at least 16,000 years old. So during so much of this of the flooding from the Missoula floods, people are there. Tribal people are seeing those events happen, and there's stories about those places and those things that are happening. I mean, Nez Perce have a word for the location where the ice dam is, and that word really suggests that it's not a one-time event. Like you're seeing this over and over and over again. And I don't have any sense of how long it would take someone to, or a community. It's community at that point. It's not a single person having this understanding, but that names really suggests that the tribal folks are watching their environment, and they're seeing these things going on, and they're recognizing that these floods are, I mean, how can you not recognize that the floods are happening? But not only are they recognizing that these huge events are happening, but they're taking it back to the source and figuring out where this stuff is coming from too. Which to me is pretty incredible, because I can't, just the thought of those floods coming down, the canyon. I mean, it's probably not a situation where if you're in the way of it, that you're ever going to get out of the way. but there's enough people, on high enough elevation watching this happen, and there's enough communication and enough people to really remember these stories and tell these stories and trace these stories back to their origin. And I'm not sure that answers your question at all.
Thanks so much. I think it gets to, I mean, this is like where you see the convergence of Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, right? This is where I think I'm asking you a scientific question, right? What I know is in our cultural stories, what we know and believe is that we had a relationship with all living beings, including salmon, Waikanish, and that salmon gave their life for us to survive. So in that context, the convergence of salmon and Wasco and Warm Springs and the mini bands of Yakima and Umatilla and Nez Perce, we came together. Like that was very close in timeline. So again, I'm always interested to see in regular everyday conversations like we're having today, where does Western science interact with traditional ecological knowledge, and what can we both learn from that interaction of two different worldviews in many cases, but also scientific in nature, because Native people were very much scientists and extremely connected to the land. So thank you for that. I did want to transition and ask Lydia a question, if that's okay. All right. In Lewiston, Idaho, there's a dormant fault line. And can you tell us a little bit more about this fault line?
I think I know the one that you're referring to. I, of course, forget the name of it at this very moment, but oh gosh, which one is it? There's a big escarpment to the north of Lewiston, right? If you're like standing in Lewiston or Clarkston and looking across the river, there's a big hill. And that's a large structure that, from what we can tell from the geology, was probably most active sometime maybe 10 or 12 million years ago, when this earlier phase of uplift and incision in the Clearwater, Salmon, and Snake Rivers, Hells Canyon area wasn't starting. And there's a couple other fault lines around there as well. I've recently sort of like been focusing in that area a whole lot. And this amount of deformation on those individual structures since the initial phase of fairly vigorous uplift, I think has become a bit subdued. That said, we are in that area in a slow strain environment. So we are still feeling the effects of the crust moving. And in some places it's moving very slowly, but those old fault lines do still exist. And in some cases they can accumulate strain very, very slowly and eventually sometimes can rupture in moderate sized earthquakes. But as of now, compared to the initial phases in the middle Miocene, 10, 12 million years ago, I think it's a little bit less active, or that particular area seems a little bit less vigorous at the moment.
I think a good
Thanks so much.
analogy-
This makes me.
Oh.
Go ahead and jump on in.
All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. I think a good analogy is a similar structure along the Walla Walla River, and the sort of eastern extension of the Horse Heaven Hills is kind of this deforming uplift, and it's probably moving relatively slow. But there was a good sized earthquake, the Milton Freewater earthquake, along that structure. I think that was 1942. Is that right, Lydia? Or
1936.
1936.
Yeah.
So they do happen in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, but it is kind of a slow. It's an environment of pretty slow deformation, and so the actual fault rupture and earthquakes are kind of widely separated, both in time and space.
I apologize to you all if there's a lag. I'm getting a spinning wheel on my end, so my bandwidth might get eaten up a little bit. So just apologize if I spoke over you. It's not intentional. Thank you for the additional insight on this. I have a question I'd love to ask you, Jim. You got a bio on your place of employment website, and you're a principal investigator, a PI in a research study called Dam Removal: Synthesis of Ecological and Physical Responses. Can you tell us a little bit more about the research and how it might apply to the geology of the river system, such as the Columbia and the Snake River?
Yeah, well, in some ways that's geologic history. When I was involved in dam removals, but it was a pretty exciting time in the early 2000s when we started taking dams out in the Pacific Northwest, sort of starting with Milltown on the Clark Fork River, east of Missoula, but then Marmot Dam on the Sandy River, Condit Dam on the White Salmon, the rivers on the dams on the Elwha River, and then more recently the dams on the Klamath. It's been a pretty fundamental sea change, and part of the motivation for that is how understanding has increased in terms of the environmental effects of having dams on rivers, and most of us in the Pacific Northwest understand those effects because our rivers are dammed. But the Snake River, for example, is one of the poster childs of how dams affect rivers, both ecologically. I mean, there's no fish passage past Hell's Canyon, and that's a huge factor in how that dam affects the river. But the dam also halts sediment moving through the system, which has huge effects on the riparian ecology and also in associated habitats. The lakes behind those dams affect water temperature and water quality. So those, what's been really interesting is, we've known about those effects for a long time now, and it's been great to witness how we've tried to mitigate some of those effects by actually taking dams out. And one thing I will say that was really remarkable about these early dam removals and watching the responses is how fast these rivers sort of came back into something that was very close to, they're never going to come back to original condition. There's too many other changes that happen in the watershed, but the rivers are resilient, and I think about that in terms of all these natural disturbances that have affected, say, the Columbia and the Snake. And it gives me personally great optimism about how these rivers, how things are going to turn out after we get through what some people might consider a pretty rough patch right now. I won't be there to see it, but it does give me optimism.
I have a quick follow-up question that I'd love to ask you. We're talking about dam removal. There's many of us that are working to remove dams along the Snake River. And from a geological perspective, how would a free-flowing Snake River behave? What would change if we remove those dams?
We get sediment moving through the system. Especially if you're talking about removing the dams in Hell's Canyon, because those dams are the ones that impound. Most of the sediment coming into the Snake is coming from the Idaho mountains, basically, and so those dams, Hell's Canyon, Oxbow, Brownlee, are trapping that sediment. It would change the nature of the flows downstream of the dams too, because those dams, they influence the way, they store a lot of water during the winter, and they, especially Brownlee, and they let that water go, and it would affect water temperature, and it would enable fish passage. So, those are, I'm sort of stating the obvious there, but those are the types of effects, and that's what people are striving for with dam removals.
Yeah, I think for many of us, things have seemed difficult, right, with dam removal, but there's so many instances that this has already happened. And I really appreciate the remarks about how the Elwha really thrived after the dam was removed. And it wasn't like years and years and years for us to see the impact of it. It was relatively quick. And with the Klamath now free flowing, I think we're all going to get to witness again how nature has the ability to heal. It has the ability to heal. And what I hope happens in the Klamath Basin is the healing of people, right? Because there was an intense conflict around the removal of those dams. And that happened before they actually got to a yes, we can proceed together and do this. So I think when nature gives us a lot of lessons about how to move in this world and demonstrates pretty clearly to us that our planet has the ability to heal, that it is very much alive, and it would be a great lesson for us to download. I want to say thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today and for lifting up the urgency. I learned a lot today about the Columbia River Basin that I didn't know. I have a lot of questions that that remain unanswered because we don't have a lot of time together, but it just inspires me to want to learn more. We know that this is an urgent issue, and the opportunity and our truth as human beings on this planet is really at stake. We all know that this is more about fish. Addressing the Snake River issue, removing the dams, is about honoring treaties, about us respecting the sacred covenant that Indigenous peoples made with Waikanish, with salmon. It's about restoring a broken system and building a future where salmon and people thrive together. We are nature. We are not a part of the natural world. We are a part of it. And it's important that we heal and thrive together. The title of today's conversation, Rock of Ages, is fitting. Just as the rocks and the riverbeds have held stories since time immemorial, so too must we stand firm in our responsibility to care for this place. Geology teaches us that landscapes shift slowly, but human action can transform them in a single lifetime, for better or for worse. So our collective work here is to really make sure that those shifts move us towards justice, resilience, and renewal. What we're going to do is we will follow up with all of you with a recording, a transcript, and some ways to take action. In the meantime, I hope that you'll carry this conversation with you, talk with your friends and families, take it into your communities, your newsrooms, your classrooms, because just like the rivers that carve the valleys over ages, it is our steady, collective effort that change becomes possible. So you can find the recording of this episode, upcoming events, and other information on ColumbiaSnakeRiver.com. And again, I just want to thank our panelists for the privilege of your time and expertise. Thank you. And I also just want to, again, thank everybody that tuned in today to listen and to learn. And again, please share this information within your community. Anyone on the panelists want to say any closing remarks? We got a few minutes.
I'd just say thank you for the opportunity, for being part of this. It's really gratifying to feel like the science we're doing has sort of broader meaning and impact than just, my file cabinets behind me. So I very much appreciate being part of this.
Yeah, thank you.
I thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I feel the same way as Jim, and I think one of the really important things to me that came out of this is just this real emphasis on the varying time scales here. A very human time scale versus a long geological time scale, and just understanding both of those for the way that this landscape looks and how it feeds all the resources that for the people here.
Yeah, I definitely second what Jim and Pat were saying. Thank you for having us. And I think if anything, what we can learn from the geology is that the rivers are persistent, and I'm pretty sure the fish are too. So, as Jim said, I think there's hope.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good hearts, good mind, good energy, and I look forward to staying connected to you all as we advance this very important issue in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you all again for your time, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.